interested in coming back to Asia, actually, so happy to introduce you to him. And, but what happens is often this doesn't happen. In fact, sometimes we get near misses, like Epogen, which is not just the drug that helped Lance Armstrong cheat his way to 7 Tour de France medals, but actually does help people deal with anemia. But it almost didn't happen. Even though this was reduced to practice at the University of Chicago back in 1971, 15 years passed before it was actually brought to market. And for every Epogen that does happen, there are other drugs or discoveries that simply don't happen. And this obviously matters for society, but also matters because when our federal government throws $40 billion a year at universities, it isn't just to help us publish instead of perish, but to try to make a difference in society. Now, our particular angle on this question of how do we prevent Rembrandts in the attic from happening is the gender gap. And you might think that, well, whenever somebody puts a question like this, the answer is always yes, right? It's kind of rhetorical. But I want to suggest why you might think it's not as much of a problem as you would think. Because if you think about what's happened in the last 40 years, there's been a marked progress in the participation of women in the scientific enterprise. So 1980, barely 1 in 5 papers, 20%, had even one woman on the byline. Whereas today, that same percentage of papers has a majority of women on them. Now that's 40 years, but that's a dramatic difference. And so you might say, well, maybe if there's a gender gap in commercialization, maybe it's not so big, maybe it's going away, maybe it's not a big deal. And what I'm going to show you today is actually the opposite is true. And we're not the first to look at this. There's been a lot of papers looking at gender gap in patenting rates. Waverly Ding, who I saw back in Seattle, has done a lot of work on this. And people have asked, but a lot of the focus and the attention has been on why don't women patent? Why don't they engage in commercialization? For example, the Thursby and Thursby paper looking not just at patenting, but patent disclosures. Even before we spend the $40,000, why don't the disclosures get written? Questions about networks, are there kind of lack of access? But it's all kind of why don't women do more of this? We're going to try to kind of conceptualize commercialization as a cooperative process where it's not just why don't women do this, but what's the other side of the table? What's happening on the other side? What role are the firms playing or not playing in this? There's also anecdata. There's a story of Katalin Kariko, who played a key role in the discovery of mRNA, whose own career experienced setbacks. And there's also another story that I can't put in print because I haven't been able to corroborate it, but I'm told that the current CSO of Moderna could not get an audience with the CEO of Moderna, had to cold call him repeatedly and say, hey, I'm out here at UMass Amherst doing mRNA research. Would you please get back to me? I think I have something you'll be interested in. I had that from someone who was a postdoc in her lab, but I'm not putting it in print yet. Anyway, the thing I want to point out is that even this Rembrandts in the attic meme is itself gendered. The authors of that book could have picked a female painter, but didn't. So we have lots of kind of hints at this, but no real large-scale evidence. And so that's what Marlene and I are going to try and do here. So what this paper will do is we will try to look at the entire scientific canon since 1800. To do that, we're going to look at about 70 million articles using the Microsoft Academic Graph, which I think some of you are familiar with, kind of like the Web of Science, but free. To do that, we will automatically label author gender via forenames. We're then going to track commercialization via patent paper pairs. So Hwang, in your presentation, you said commercialization is hard to do. You're right. We're going to take a stab at it, not by using university licenses, but by inferring patent paper pairs at scale. And then we're going to try to address kind of the elephant in the room, which is how do you know which papers have commercial potential? And the KAIST data that we saw this morning is probably a wonderful way to get at this. But at scale, we're going to try and do this using twins. And for the most part, using the Michael-Bicard twins. This is dissertation. But also using twins from the Protein Data Bank. This is the Hill and Stein version. We're going to hand label gender among those twins, which is going to, of course, be a tiny subset of the full data set. So we can take off the table what's the ex-ante commercial potential for these papers. Okay, preview of findings. We will document a gender gap of about 13%, both in the population and also in the subset of twins. It's a gender gap that's growing over time and not shrinking, although I'm not going to show you that graph in particular. More importantly, it doesn't seem to be driven by the women don't patent story. We're not going to see a gender gap for self-commercialization, but only for cooperative commercialization. So when women do startups, we don't see a gap. We'll see some, but not much, but kind of weak evidence for the classic mechanisms of representation, networks, and so on. Weak enough that I'm not going to show you those tables. I'm going to focus instead on evidence of bias from the firm side in 3 ways. One in terms of firms ignoring articles that don't use words like breakthrough and novel and first to the world, which women tend not to do, as we'll see. Second, we'll take advantage of a natural experiment that improves access, possibly reducing that gap, but actually widens it. And finally, we'll demonstrate gender homophily in the commercialization process itself. Okay, so first off, let's talk about what commercialization is and how we're going to capture that. And I'll use here a paper from Jennifer Doudna. Am I saying that right, by the way? People always correct me. Is it Doudna, Doudna? I don't know. But anyway, Jennifer wrote this paper. This is one of the CRISPR papers. She's the lab manager, and so the final author or last author on this paper. Now I want to show you one of Jennifer's patents, okay? Now this patent also has Jennifer on the patent, and the patent cites as other references or prior art that same paper that you saw on the previous slide. Now you don't see Jennifer's name here because she's the last author, and in the prior art, the attorney only listed the first author, but it's the same paper. And so we can say, well, so this patent not only cites this as prior art, but we see overlap in the inventor name and the author name. And so we say, okay, maybe Jennifer was not just saying, okay, this is an interesting reference, but Jennifer was maybe involved in the commercialization of this paper. Now this patent was assigned to Caribou Biosciences, of which Jennifer is a co-founder and a member of the scientific advisory board. So there's one example, and there's probably a license involved. We don't have the licensing data. Now slightly closer to home, I'll show you another example not involving a license. So back in my previous life, I used to be a speech recognition researcher, and if you've ever been on the phone and you've spelled a name and said B as in boy or P as in Paul, so when I was a young man, I developed an algorithm where you don't have to do that. You can just spell the name, and I keep track of the letters, and I infer whether you mean P as in Paul or B as in boy. I wrote a paper and published it in an obscure journal in 1994. And then in my first startup, we patented that method, and we cited that paper as prior art. And so even though there's no license, and MIT never talked to us, that would also be an instance of commercialization, because it's commercializing that same, because we own the patent on that. So if you call up to get your drug and they say, spell the name of the drug, that's my patent, okay? So a couple of instances of that. So let's go to some estimation. So our benchmark probability model that we'll use for the cross-section is just to estimate the probability of being a patent paper pair using the gender structure of the paper, control variables for the paper, the usual suspects, number of authors, and so on, publication year, and field fixed effects. When we do that, we'll get negative signs on having at least one female or percentage of female authors on the paper, which you could interpret in a couple of ways. If you were very cynical, you might say, well, maybe women don't do very good work. And you'd be dead wrong if you said that, because if you switched the dependent variable to number of academic citations, you would see highly positive and significant coefficients. And there are a number of papers showing similar things in particular subfields, but we see that across all of science. Now you might have a different reaction, and moreover, while that publishing gap is shrinking, this commercialization gap is growing. But you might have another reaction. You might say, well, maybe it's better science, but maybe it's more fundamental, more basic, not so vulgar, not applied. And so maybe the science that women is doing is more foundational. Maybe we'll see the value later, and it's just the firms aren't as interested because doesn't have commercial value today. And that's a trickier one to deal with, because it's hard for us to know ex ante what the commercial value is or will be. We just can't see it for an individual paper. But what if we could tell two papers that had the same commercial value, even if we don't know what the commercial value is? That's what we're going to try to do. And here's an example of this. These are two papers which I will represent to you are really the same paper or the same discovery. The Scientist magazine said they are, and without spending too many minutes, said it's two identifications of a critical missing link in the apoptosis signaling pathway for cell death. That's the reason that Cell magazine published them back to back in the same issue of the same journal. Why would they do that? Because they hate retractions. Last year, a Nobel Prize winner, you may have heard, retracted a paper. It happens to the best of us. They love it when multiple people, and we're all chasing the same scientific frontier. And whereas in our field, sometimes you'll just give up on a paper when someone beats you to it. In the hard sciences, it's very common for people to publish the same thing. Not always in the same journal, but sometimes with a slight priority lag. And so and this is Mikhail Bacard's dissertation. He came up with this methodology, which is to look for co-citations. So looking for papers that are cited not just in the same reference list, but in the same parenthesis over and over. So we can say, aha, maybe this is really the same discovery. And so what we did is we built a server farm in my basement. After Halvarian said, no, you can't have the Google Scholar data, we went and got it legally. Very slowly wrote a bot that every 6 minutes goes and grabs a PDF that's not paywalled. And over 19 months, we pulled down almost all the papers that cited the twins in the same reference list, and we got the PDF, and then we crawled them. So we basically took the Bacard twins and scaled it up to the whole of the Web of Science, or MAG. So what do we get for our effort? Well, what we're able to do then is go back and re-estimate that equation for pairs of papers that ex ante should have the same commercial potential. And so then if we have a patent that in theory could cite one or the other of these two papers or be paired with them, we can say, okay, suppose that the paper gets commercialized with one of these patents but not the others. Is there something about the authorship structure, including the gender of these papers, that will predict which one gets cited and not the other? And so we put fixed effects on the discovery and re-estimate what we've done. Now what do we get for our trouble? Now we drop the number of observations by a few orders of magnitude, of course. And we get pretty much the same results, whether we look at least one, percentage of women, mixed gender teams, and so on. And interestingly, I didn't show you this before, if we look at papers where women are the last author, this is the Jennifer Dowden example, the effect seems to be, sorry, I use effect loosely. This is not causal because there's selection into teams, but the association seems more pronounced where women are last authors on the team. So a couple other words about the twins analysis. We redo this using conditional logit, which will drop out all the pairs where there's no variation, and we hand code the gender. Because what we're doing right now is we're guessing at the gender using name algorithms, which are imprecise. We use 90% thresholds, but if you're going to make mistakes, so we hand collect them for all the ones that won't be dropped using conditional logit and get same results. We then go back and rebuild twins using the protein data bank. This is the Ryan Hill and Carolyn Stein approach. Get similar results that way. Hand collect gender for all of those. So we feel like there's something here. The question is, what's going on? And how am I doing on time? Who's my timekeeper? 10?
You're losing time.
I'll just keep going. All right.
You have 9.
Plenty of time. Okay. So what's going on? First question is, well, you're using patent paper pairs to define commercialization. Is it just patenting? Is it just mechanical? So one thing we do to see about that, and I'm going to apologize to my discussant because this was not in the paper you got, is we take advantage of the fact that commercialization, and again, the literature is often looked at, do women do this? But we think commercialization is a two-way street. And so we break commercialization into two modes. One is where you're cooperatively commercializing with existing firms, and the other is where you're self-commercializing in a startup. You decide to go. Now, of course, you're working with employees. You may need to raise funding, probably in these. And we only see the gap precisely estimated in the cooperative one. So it doesn't seem, and I should probably make this yellow, not red, doesn't seem it's just a patenting story. We also look at the other factors from prior literature, and I'm not going to show you these for interest of time. We see weak evidence for networks, that there's slightly more commercialization in fields where women are more highly represented, but not strong factors, which leads us to possible bias on the part of firms. Let me first draw your attention to a paper you may or may not have heard of. So Lerschen, Miller, Sorensen, and Jana. This is a graph from their paper where they show the use of what they call bragging words in science. And words like novel, unique, favorable, breakthrough, so on. Yes, yeah, you know the story, right? So we replicate this first in the entire scientific corpus, and then with the twins, where you have pretty close to perfect controls for scientific. So when men and women report the same scientific discovery, women don't brag. Now we do one tweak where if novel shows up in a bigram with coronavirus, we throw that out because we don't think that counts as a bragging word. But we see the very same thing. Now, but then we take it to the next step and say, what about outcomes? Now, you and I are not fooled if someone says breakthrough. You don't get any more scientific citations, but firms are. If you take this to the commercialization, it turns out that firms are more likely to cite the twin that has a bragging word in it, the twin paper, and especially with a mixed gender team that has a male last author versus a female last author. Why do I mention that? Because if you think about who's more likely to choose the words in the abstract and the title, I think that's when the lab manager is likely to come in. So maybe that's saying that, so firms seem to pay more attention to bragging articles and women don't brag as much, which may suggest there's some attention deficit disorder on the part of firms. Now given that, what if we can do something about attention? What if we could shock attention or awareness? Because we know lots of literature from Jeff and Scott on biological repositories and others. What if we had a shock that could increase awareness? And so we're going to take advantage of an open access mandate. Everyone knows about the NIH mandate. It was also extended by the Obama administration to every 9-figure budget office in the administration, and it was staggered. And so we take the Santana estimator and apply that, and what do you think happened? Because if the differential is due to just firms not being aware of papers by women, you might think that greater awareness would shrink the gap, right? But that's not what happened. The opposite happened. Greater awareness actually exacerbated the gap, which makes us think it's not just awareness, it could actually be intentional bias, which leads us to our final thing, which I hope I have time for, which suggests maybe there's actually an active, if implicit effort. There's a great JEP by Small and Pager about institutional bias, about potential gender homophily in the commercialization process. So you can go back to thinking about commercialization as a two-way street, two sides of the table. Let's say you're a scientist looking for inventors at firms to commercialize with. What do we know about the gender of inventors? We didn't know much until about 18 months ago when the USPTO put out this database of the percentage of female inventors per year. It's getting better, really slowly. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go re-estimate the twins regressions, which were only at the twin level, saying nothing about the patent. Now we're going to add the percentage of male inventors on the patent and do this at a dyad level, make this equation a little more complicated, taking the gender composition of the paper and of the patent, interact those, and look for gender homophily in terms of which paper gets commercialized with this patent. And when we do that, the news is all pretty ugly. You get homophily for one female author for a higher percentage, and also for mixed gender teams with a female last author. So I think my time's running out, so I will try and wrap up here. Do I have more time? No, I think I'm out of time. 1 minute, that is you have not time. So to wrap up, I think we've shown some population scale evidence of a small double-digit gap in the commercialization of science, not due to any commercial potential. It's growing and likely due to bias on the part of twins. One last thing I want to say is that if If you're interested in this, all the data we've used here is open sourced. You can go grab it. You can grab all the patent to paper citations, self-citations. We'll be publishing these patent to paper pairs really soon, as well as there was talk about mapping assignees to firms. We're going to be adding a database of assignee age for all the assignees pretty soon. We're mapping them to open corporates, so you can look at all the little tiny assignees as well. And with that, I have 0 minutes left. Thanks much.
Oh, we've lost my slides. Oh, there they are. My slides are so old school. Yes, no, this is, yeah. Okay. Well, what happened? There we go. Okay, so the paper is contributing to the literature on gender gap in science. This is widely, as Matt said, if we begin with, is there a gender gap? But don't even need to finish the sentence, right? There's been all these policy interventions designed to address this with mixed success. And so part of what's going on here is to sort of document that this gap is in this other aspect, and to think about why there could be such a gap, to try and get a little bit at the mechanisms, because that's very important. And there's a kind of fundamental summary way of saying this, which is basically, is there a deficit model here? I don't think you use this language, Matt, but are the women broken in some way? If we could fix them, then the problem would go away. Or is there something sort of more structural here that or at least, I mean, a different way to say it, Matt's result is that it's a deficit model, but it's the firms that need to be fixed, right? And so in this case, we're going to look at the commercialization of academic science, right? That's what we're talking about here. Although, I actually do, this is a very small, minor point. Are you actually selecting that the original papers were academics? Or did you not? As far as I could tell, that wasn't actually checked, right? If these were industry publications, are they in your data? Okay, yeah, it was a small point, but I just, but the key contribution is, and this is a good example, what he just told us, right? So the key contribution is that they're going to use scientometric data to examine these questions at scale, right? So I've looked at some of this stuff at the using surveys of inventors, and you find some interesting things. I didn't publish it because we have other things to do, but this is we're going to look at the whole of the publishing data and then see what happens. And so that's one. But the other thing, and this is the really, I think, powerful contribution, is the use of the twin studies to try to rule out anything that, as much as possible, anything that has to do with the science itself. And therefore we can, the content of the publication. And therefore we can focus on these characteristics of either the inventing team, the publishing team, or the presentation of the publication. That's where the keywords show, the bragging words show up, right? So key finding, women's publications are less likely to become firm patents. And this is robust to many ways of doing the comparison. So that's all very well done. And that there's some evidence, the sort of last point, that the gap is due to biases on the demand side, that the firms are less likely to take up women's findings. That's the kind of, to me, easiest way to say that. And this may be related to gender differences in the framings. This is the point about gendered language, right? And again, this is where we get to pat ourselves on the back. The nice little thing he says, but the scientists aren't fooled. Like, we don't cite more because you used bragging words. Why bother, right? But it gets the paper taken up by the firm. And so this is an important contribution to the debates on gender inequalities in S&T more broadly, and some pointers on where there could be policy intervention. So great paper, really interesting, and it really, I think, powerful sort of technology of analysis to get at these questions. A lot of my comments are going to have to do with, I basically look at two things. One, measurement issues, and two, refine one of the mechanisms that you talked about, right? So the measurement issue just is, well, what do we mean by commercialization here? So first, a lot of us who work in this area, we would call this commercial activity, right? We would not call this commercialization simply because, basically we don't actually know what happened to this invention, right? We know that there was so a lot of the people who look at this would say survey data or something. We say, did you apply for a patent? Did you get a patent, right? Are you involved with a firm, right? And so we often call that a commercial activity. So, it's a quibble. But let's just be clear what the measure is here, because it's a multi-component measure, and it's trying really hard to get at, what exactly are we trying to talk about here, right? So we say we have a patent paper pair. What is that? Okay. There's a publication that is linked to a patent where at least one author-inventor overlap. Not necessarily the woman that we're talking about, right? So it could be like the women, get dropped off and the men are there. 2, it's assigned to a firm. So these are not university patents, right? Those are excluded. Although there's another version where there's a 2-step. And then the patent cites the pub, right? And so the illustration was to give you the 3 pieces, right? So my first question is just a small point. How robust are the findings to relaxing the last assumption, right? You may or may not cite the pub that was, that this pair is built from, right? Because, there's lots of reasons things show up in the citation lists of references, of patents, right? The reference list of patents. So it's just a robustness question. And this is this came up in the morning, but I got confused by one thing, and I don't know if this was a typo or a misunderstanding. It's a requirement that the publication happen before the patent application. Not before the patent issue, but before the patent application. But in general, the pub should come after the application because of the novelty requirement, right? So I'm confused by this, right? And so just clarify what that means. Now, this, and you're clear about this, this leaves out lots and lots of kinds of commercial activity and especially commercialization, right? So licensing, right, which wouldn't necessarily match a PPP. I can license without there being a PPP because maybe none of the licensee may not have me as an inventor, right? You talk about that. Startups or other forms of commercialization that don't depend on a patent, right? Lots of things don't have patents, right? Software sometimes, but, just in general, not everything's patented. And especially sort of knowledge wrapped up in a person, right? So Nelson talks about this, Paula talks about this, right? And so, okay, that's fine. The firms that build on university discoveries, maybe with faculty consulting, but with patenting on their own. So I take the Amgen story different from the way you take it. And I've sort of been, following that story for a while. That's a lovely example of the existence proof that patents are not necessary for tech transfer and commercialization, right? So, it's a different version of the same story, right? And the University of Chicago, sort of was very upset about this. Why? It was a very successful tech transfer, right? EPO and Amgen, that's huge, right? Okay, Chicago didn't make any money off of it, but, the guy published the paper, it got taken up, and it, became a commercial product. And Amgen has patents, right? And then if you just look at citing without the inventor overlap, what do you see? There's the Samadavor and Jones paper that shows some massive number of publications end up directly or indirectly getting taken up, right? Getting commercialized by using citation linkages, right? And then many of these patents, possibly most of these patents, right, would not be commercialized, right? Actually brought to market, right? We just know that not everything gets commercialized. And in addition, in many cases, the professor's patent is just a marker of productivity or output. Either the professors are doing this to show that their grants did something, or in places where it's common for industry scientists or engineers to do visiting things in the university lab, and they have to document what they were doing during that time, they would have a patent, and that might show up in your, in your data, right? And this varies by country, and again, you're using the whole globe, right? So I think the paper could do more. I'm not saying you should do any of these things, right? I'm just saying this is helping to put what you are doing in context. What you're getting, what you're not getting, how it's different from the other people, and so on. Some of that's driven by what data you have and versus you don't have. Your data has lots of strengths. And some of it's driven by just different views about what we mean, what's our target, right? What we're interested in, right? So I just want you to think about that context. There's this other issue, and I think I know the answer, which is, you mentioned this, the names drop off between the pub and the patent. Lazzoni has a great paper on this where this is really gendered, right? And related also to position. I think it doesn't matter because you're using the author list, not the inventor list. But I just want, sort of a little clarification here. Okay, so here's I might take 90 seconds here. But you look at lots of things. You mention this lab head effect, and you basically say there's a small effect here. I think the effect might be stronger if you focus the analysis in a little bit different way. A lot of times I think you're not getting the right comparison, or you're not getting the comparison that's the most telling, is the way I would say it. I would argue, and you've mentioned this, the lab head may be critical in the, the framing of the language, in, executing on the network, pushing, the student to commercialize it or the lab head to commercialize it, and maybe the source of the homophily, right? And there's some, priors that suggest that. And so this is in addition, not instead of the firm effect. But I think there might be something there, right? So I basically went through a lot of your tables and said, if you did a different comparison, what would you see, right? So if we compare, directly the male last author and the female last author for the equivalent case, right? Is 275 bigger than the 090, right? And the same, this way, the male first author versus the female first author with the same female, And so a lot of these these coefficient comparisons, and you might need different controls than these, would allow you to tease that out, right? Similarly, when you do the network effect, you use all the authors, right? What if you only use the network of the the senior author, and then redo that, right? And does that explain away some of your effect, right? And so this is some evidence that says maybe that would happen, right? So this is from table 11. What if you test with all female teams, because you have this problem of the number of women, the share of women, all this stuff. So say the whole team is women, and then the last author is either man or woman, right? You have a lot of cases. You should have enough to be able to test this, right? And then does that lead to the more boastful words effect, right? Is can you isolate that? And again, there's some evidence that the male last author, mixed gender male versus female, right? That the effect may be different there, but this isn't the right control, right? And then comparing the same thing for the commercialization, right? And again, so this is, do the boastful words have an effect conditioned on what the last author is, right? So this is an important contribution to the literature, that you've built a powerful machinery for testing these questions. That's the big takeaway. Some fine-tuning might make some of your points more clearly. There's probably multiple things going on, and there's no requirement that it be one or the other, and you deal with that. And then lastly, good luck, and look forward, coming soon.
Questions in 3 areas. The first area was on the natural language processing that you use to classify gender. In many Asian cultures, the first name isn't gendered, such that if you use algorithms to classify using the first name, that it's kind of a random assignment of the gender. How did you tackle the non-gendered first names in many Asian cultures? A related question is, although it's rare, it could happen that there were different peoples with the same name. Are there any additional data you have on an individual such that you can match people across a paper and a patent that can verify that it's actually really the same person and not by coincidence a person with the same name? Second area of question is on pregnancies as a driver for less commercialization activity of pregnancies. In that when women have children, their attachment to the child on average is stronger than the father's attachment to the child. So time becomes more precious. So there's a question of what to prioritize. And say you're a pre-tenure female academic, then in the tenure review, the publications may be worth more than the patents that you generate. And then there might be a focus of getting the publications you need for tenure and de-emphasizing the patents. And then the last question is, you have global data, which is so cool because you have different institutional environments in which patents happen. But I haven't seen you exploit the geographic differences yet. I was just wondering if there could be more insights gleaned from the political environment in different countries and the gender differences.
Any question or comments?
So, great paper. I guess I have to keep this on. So I think I had two comments. The first, so I love this idea where you're using the bragging, you know what I'm saying, the style of writing as something that is itself gendered. And what I couldn't figure out from the table you just presented, but I think I thought about this a few weeks ago when I'd seen it earlier, and I think I couldn't figure it out then either. If you do that as a direct effect, is there a separate then effect of it being a team with women? Do you see what I'm saying? The way you've done it, you've sort of are estimating two effects, and you're saying the effect is bigger, you know what I'm saying? But it seems like, in other words, is it that the firms demand the bragging? Do you see what I'm saying? And so since women don't brag as much, they don't get cited in the firm patent, if you see what I'm saying, right? But there's no separate, like if that's the linkage, then you don't need a separate interaction effect on women itself.
That's the weird thing. So,
But the way you've done it, you haven't tested that exactly.
but there's both. That's the weird thing. There's a base effect of gravity.
Those two things are, no, but you separate, I thought you have two coefficients.
The interactions. There's a base and there's an interaction effect with gender.
Okay.
It's really-
Okay. Well, let me just say that having now seen it twice, that was not clear to me. So at least in the 20-minute presentation, that's me. Okay, gotta brag more, Matt. Okay. The second piece is, and I think this is consistent with what John was saying. I think that there's some very big benefit here of clarifying, and maybe there's multiple papers, or I don't know what that is. But are you testing a hypothesis? At which point I'm not sure that a population level estimate on the entirety of science is what you want. Like, in other words, is the point to identify an ideal experiment in the data and cut the sample in a way that allows you to get at the cleanest test of the mechanisms for gendered, for the Cassatts in the attic? Do you see what I'm saying? Or is the point to get a rough and independent of the mechanism, a rough and ready estimate of the degree to which the Cassatts in the attic effect is pervasive across science? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I feel like because there were multiple data sets, depending on, like, with the twins or whatever, that sort of it was very hard for me to get my mind around about what was the population, were you testing a hypothesis or are you estimating a population parameter which might be associated or not with the hypothesis I'm interested in?
I get you.
Yeah. Nonetheless, the center of it there still holds, right, John? Okay.
Just very quick, I wonder, like, of course you have first name to tell the gender, but of course you also have a last name to tell the cultural background, right? Maybe you can, do some cross-section analysis to see maybe some culture tend to be more breaking, right? Breakers love breakers. So that is related to what Scott just mentioned. Well, that's just about fitting. That's really not about breaking thing. And of course, now back to my original point, is more like you can use the cultural background. Maybe that may explain something, or at least enrich the story. Yeah.
With regards to the measurement issue that has been brought up, I'm just wondering if the PPP measure has been compared to, say, the FDA data. So with drugs approvals, at a firm level, we would be able to actually see all the patterns, all the scientific publications that are associated with it. It's going to be a subsample of what you would want to present, but there we have more information, and potentially that subsample might be useful for testing some of the hypotheses that you might have.
I'm next.
Jeff?
So this is tremendous, Matt. I mean, the data work that goes into this, the 1,000 ways that you're trying to kill the result. Can you kill the result by looking at firms started by women or led by women? And you may have done that, and I may have missed it because there's so many things going on. Yeah. Like if there's a homophily, if it's a homophily effect, you might imagine that if the board is 50% women, or the scientific team is 50% women, maybe they'll prefer the twins with women rather than not. You can imagine all types of homophily effects, maybe cultural or maybe other. So I wonder if there's a homophily effect or a gender effect, and whether you can use differences in the firm features to see whether that kills the result.
So maybe this is the minor point, but I'm super interested in this paper because of my gender. But, I thought about if you find, it's a very psychological issue, so I'm not sure we can address this one. But if you check that if there is the same last name in the author set, that means they have a chance to have the husband in a kind of same authorship. In that case, woman has a tendency to be intimidated because they should, they want to give a chance to her husband, right? If it is about commercialization. Or if in the same team, somebody is already commercializing the similar ideas, the woman has a tendency to, okay, just you go, right? So I'm not sure, but it's a very psychological issue in Asia. Maybe Asia thing, I don't know, but if you can check those things, yeah, I think it's interesting. Thank you. Okay, now any other comments? Okay, very good. We are on time now. So thank you. And now, thank you, Matt. And thank you, John. And thank you all comments. It's really great. Now, Sunwoo. Okay? Oh, yeah. Oh, yes, yes. Yeah.
This is an unusually excellent set of comments, and I really mean it. These are great. And John, thank you. These are, I need those slides. They're terrific. I think one thing I should really clarify, because there are a lot of questions about the PPP measure, and the one thing I want to clarify is that, so you asked, like, what happens if you relax the citation requirement? I actually don't want to. So there have been 26 different data sets of patent paper pairs made over the years, and none of them ever had a citation requirement. And I think there needs to be one. And I think it's because otherwise you're guessing. And I think the citation is actually really important. And we never had a citation database before. And so I actually start with that. You're making me think, I don't want to relax it. We could, but I don't want to, because then I think we're going to get a lot of false positives. I also don't want to relax the author overlap, because if it's just citation, people cite stuff for all kinds of crazy strategic reasons. The other thing is that we do more complex, it isn't just one author overlap. What we do is we check to make sure there's a critical mass of overlap between authors. We check for prior probabilities to make sure the John Smith problem doesn't have, or the John Walsh problem actually. But if you have a very rare name that overlaps, or if you get like exact match on first and middle name and last name, then John P. Smith is okay. And so we try to be pretty careful about that. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention is that for a prior paper, we hand-checked a random sample of 40 of these patent paper pairs, and we found that 39 out of 40 were actual commercialization, like actual startups that came out of it. So we have done some hands-on verification to make sure it's not just a really noisy measure, because I totally get your concern that, what is it? It could just be whatever. And I think the hand checking is really important, because otherwise, what are we doing? And I really appreciate, and your comments are really fantastic. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's the last section. Let me try to finish everything on time. So thank you, organizer, for having including my paper into the program. The paper, the Contingent Employment and Innovation, was motivated by the observation that contingent employment is large and growing everywhere in the world. They now represent about 40% of the labor force among the OECD countries. It's similar in Korea. But we know little about its implications on firm outcomes. Practitioners mostly talk about benefits, immediate benefits, such as lower labor cost, greater flexibility, and potentially higher labor productivity, given the threat of termination. But there might be costs as well in the long run. For example, contingent contracts may discourage employees from making long-term efforts, which is essential to do something like innovation. So in this paper, I aim to narrow this gap of our understanding by studying the effect of contingent employment on innovation, focusing on the cost side. So who are contingent workers? The definition varies widely across countries, but simplest way to think about them is all but permanent employees. They exist at all skill levels and ranges from low skill ones, such as janitors, to high skill ones, such as doctors, lawyers, and consultants. But the paper focuses on medium skill ones who have barely failed to secure permanent positions. They're not going to make radical innovation, but they probably have the ability, maybe, to make incremental innovation. For example, they may make the process of producing auto parts from like 10 seconds to 8 seconds. That sort of things often are patented. And when it comes to their existence, they're likely to be offered and accept these contracts because outside options worsen in labor markets, while these contracts still pay the premium as high as the cost of switching to other occupations. And more formally, my research question is whether contingent employment of skilled labor affect corporate innovation. Theoretical prediction is straightforward. Greater dismissal risk and few rewards for long-term performance will undermine innovation incentives of employees. So we should observe smaller amount of innovation output created. But it's ex ante unclear whether they can indeed innovate, making my question as an empirical question. And here's a summary of the findings. First, I find that innovation output increases when firms convert contingent workers into permanent hires, following a shock that I'm going to elaborate in the following slide. And the results are conditional on long-term rewards in place, consistent with the Manzo's innovation motivating incentive scheme, which has both, two components, short-term tolerance and rewards for long-term success. But I do not find that managers have reacted to increased innovation input, probably because operating leverage has not increased. Only 10% of employees were affected by the shock, to be explained. And there are other reasons to be elaborated very soon. So probably for the reason R&D and capital intensity have not increased. And when it comes to who innovates, apart from the former contingent workers, 3 other groups of employees can potentially innovate for whichever reasons. New hires, existing inventor employees, and existing non-inventor employees. First, I find that new hires not innovate more. And second, I find that new inventors, including former contingent workers, innovate more and better, but that happens only through collaboration with existing inventor employees, who also create more and better non-collaborative patents. So you can think of this, as like this, the situation where senior faculty become more productive when the highly motivated junior faculty joins in. I find the research and patterns consistent with the story. Lastly, I find the evidence of spillover effect. Innovation-associated employee departure increases following the shock. So to answer the research question, I exploit the quasi-natural experiment that has 3 factors. The first one is a work arrangement unique in Korea. Under the arrangement, contingent workers do the same core tasks as regular employees hired when the labor market was relatively strong, and they work full-time. So the arrangement is helpful because that mitigates the concern that contingent workers who I study differ from regular employees, not only in terms of the innovation incentive, but also in terms of skilled tasks they're assigned to and their flexibility for their preference for flexibility. And second factor is Supreme Court ruling against this arrangement, which provides contingent workers with innovation incentives. A nice thing about the ruling as a shock is that it had a little impact on operating leverage and therefore managerial innovation incentive. This is important because otherwise it's going to be difficult to tease out, who account for the increase in innovation output between managers and employees. And there was a little impact because only about 10% of employees were affected. And what firms had to do was to convert these contingent workers into the lowest paid regular employees. So the cost was low. And lastly, the court did not enforce immediate conversion, so firms were able to negotiate with contingent workers to do the conversion gradually when regular employees leave or retire. And the third factor is the data on indirect employment, which is really novel, I believe. It makes visible indirectly hired contingent workers who do not show up in the data based on disclosure. And also, as a random sample of establishments, which help mitigate the concern that the traded establishments that used contingent workers before the ruling differ from the establishments that did not use contingent workers, differ in terms of unobservable characteristics. Okay. Contribution, to my knowledge, it's a first paper studying the effect of the contingent employment on innovation, or generally long-term firm outcome. Also, it's first to show that the Manzo's scheme also applies to rank and file employees. As you know, there are many papers on managers showing that the scheme governs managers in different contexts. And it also has the small literature about innovation by rank and file employees. Let me take a moment to explain my experiment. So the contingent workers who I study are so-called in-house subcontracted workers. They work with regular employees of the main contractor, but within the main contractor's factory, but they're hired through subcontractors, often located within the factory of the main contractor. They look like agency temps, but they're different in that they are hired through, not through the staffing agencies, but through in-house subcontractors and work for the main contractor almost permanently. And there was a shock in 2010 ruling. The court concluded that they were misclassified. Then key legal issue was whether or not they were supervised by the main contractor. If they were supervised and used that way for more than 2 years, they're employees of the main contractor according to the Korean labor law. And if they were not supervised, they are employees of subcontractors. So I define treatment at the establishment level based on the pre-ruling percentage of in-house subcontracted workers. And for supplementary firm level tests, which I do because I do not observe patterns from the establishment level data, I define treatment crudely at the establishment level. Specifically, I define all firms in 4 industries that heavily used in-house subcontracted workers at traded firms and all firms in 20 other manufacturing industries as control firms. But still, it's possible that the industry-specific time trends affect the estimated treatment effect. So I carefully do matching and make sure that there are no pre-trends. But I acknowledge that the firm level evidence is at best suggestive. Yeah. So data, the sample period is from 2005 to 2017, including 2010, the shock year in the middle. And the source is workplace panel survey administered by Korean Labor Institute. And the sample include establishments hiring 30 people or more, and they're randomly sampled for each stratum defined by industry, region, and size groups. And they're surveyed biannually. And as I mentioned earlier, I observed indirect hires, which is fantastic. Also observe information about the compensation and human capital inflow and outflow, and a little bit about innovation output and input. I here measure innovation output by capitalized patent cost, that is cost incurred to file for patents, because that's the only thing that I observe about innovation output. And as I mentioned earlier, because I did not observe patents in this data set, I also use firm level data where I observe patents and do supplementary tests. And this table shows 2009 snapshot of manufacturing employment in Korea. First, it shows that indirectly hired contingent workers account for 13.2% of the total employment, which is much greater than 1.7% of the directly hired contingent workers. So this demonstrates the worth of using this data to study contingent employment. And subcontracted workers account for 10.6%. So what you're going to see from now on is going to be the effect of converting these 10.6% into regular employees. I do standard difference in difference estimation using the following specifications. I indexes establishment, J industry, to which establishment I belong, our province, C foundation year cohort, U unit, distinguishing single and multi-unit establishments, T year. And key variable is treat tilde, which is defined as treat dummy times treatment intensity measured by pre-ruling percentage of subcontracted workers times 100. The last piece is just to make the interpretation of coefficients easier. And treat dummy takes the value 1 for treated establishments that used subcontracted workers before the ruling, and 0 for treated control establishments that did not do, yeah. And post takes the value of 1 for the period starting 2 years after the ruling, and 0 otherwise. I picked 2 because it takes time to innovate, and the conversion has been gradual. And I include controls, loosely motivated by theories. and establishment fixed effect to control for any time invariant establishment characteristics that are known to affect innovation output. And industry reason by year fixed effect, there are to control for time varying industry and reason, the province specific characteristics that may affect employment and innovation at the same time. And research, first summary stat. This table compares traded and controlled establishments as of 2009, year before the ruling. First, it shows that they're pretty similar. The difference in means in column 5 is computed for each stratum, within stratum. And it also shows that traded establishments used more subcontracted workers, potentially as substitutes of regular employees, and simultaneously produced less innovation output. And traded establishments are more likely to be unionized as well, which can be one of the reasons why they used subcontracted workers in the first place. But that is unlikely to affect the treatment effects because it's not easy to undo unions. And I confirmed that data and also control for unionization in every specification. And this table first confirms the effect of the rolling unemployment. And column 1 shows that subcontracted employment declines by 1.35 percentage point for traded establishments that used 1 percentage point more subcontracted workers before the ruling compared to control establishments after the ruling. But columns 2 to 6 show that other classes of contingent employment have not changed. And column 7 shows that there has been almost one-to-one substitution between subcontracted employment and regular employment. And column A shows that total employment has not changed much. It declined a bit, like 1%, but it's not significant. And the decline is not surprising because the conversion is not costless. And the researcher robust to the alternative definitions for treat and post dummies and stratum-based fixed effect. Also, if it's not sensitive to controls, if I exclude all the controls, the research will remain. So the research are not sensitive to the any specification choices. And here's the dynamics. Before the ruling, the number of subcontracted workers is similar between traded and controlled establishments. But it's smaller for traded establishments after the treatment. But that's not observed for other classes of contingent employment, independent contractors, dispatched workers, day workers, fixed-term workers, and part-timers. Then I look at innovation and find that innovation often measured by capitalized patent cost increases in columns 1 and 2. Both in level and per human capital input measured by wage expenditure. And columns 3 and 4 uses firm level data in which I observe patents and show that the number of patents also increases. And the dynamics, you see that the treatment effect starts in year 3, which makes sense because it takes, again, time to innovate. And the treatment has been gradual. And channel, when it comes to channel, I first find evidence consistent with the innovation incentive. As you know, the Manju's innovation motivating incentive scheme has 2 components, short-term tolerance and long-term rewards. Here I measure long-term rewards using merit pay, the annual salary system, with which employees can negotiate the next year's salary based on their performance this year. And find that the increase in innovation is primarily driven by traded establishments that had merit pay in place before the ruling. And columns 2 to 4 look at the breakdown of basic pay and show that the research are almost entirely driven by traded establishments that had skill-based basic pay in place. I find this research particularly interesting because if you think about it, like unlike large-scale, the R&D-driven innovation projects, the type of innovation created by rank and file employees are, I think, is likely coincidental. Something that happens while acquiring firm-specific human capital and skill. So I think these make sense. And column 5, Leslie showed that the results are the strongest from the traded establishments that offer both merit pay and skill-based basic pay. And I also looked at the incentive schemes for middle managers and executives, find that their incentives not explain the increase in innovation output. And also innovation input is not sensitive to their incentive schemes. I also formally test the managerial responses and find that operating leverage does not increase, and costs of the ruling or the lost benefits of contingent employment are not high, confirming the anecdotal evidence. Also, probably for the reason I find that R&D and capital intensity do not increase as well. Then so far the research together suggests that contingent employment bears the cost of less innovation for unclear benefits. Then the question is why firms or managers do this. I mean, they use contingent contracts to hire skilled labor in the first place. A testable possibility is managerial myopia, or if there are other stories you can think of, please let me know. And I test based on foreign ownership suggests the evidence consistent with that possibility. Specifically, I find that the increase in innovation output is not observed from the traded establishments that had a higher foreign ownership, and therefore less likely to have a myopic manager. And as I mentioned, when it comes to who innovate, I do not find that new hires innovate more. Their representation has not increased after the ruling at the traded establishments. Also, any increase in their representation is not associated with the increase in innovation output. That's what columns 3 and 4 show. Yeah, the increase between year before and 3 years after the ruling. And to study and then I use firm level data to check the innovation by existing inventor employees and the existing non-inventor employees. What I do there is to divide a group of inventors, divide inventors into 2 groups, new inventors and existing inventors, and find that existing inventor employees innovate more and better. And but I cannot distinguish the existing non-inventor employees from the former contingent workers. So their invention is not separately testable. But still, they're not newly incentivized, and nor do they have the experience of creating and patenting innovation. So I suspect that their contribution would be negligible. And yeah, but that's still just my interpretation. And lastly, the evidence of spillover effect. Column 1 shows that voluntary employee departure increases. And a reason for voluntary departure is startup creation. And column 2 shows that that doesn't happen for involuntary departure. A primary reason of which is retirement. And column 3 shows that the voluntary employee departure is associated with the changes in, possibly associated with the changes in the innovation output. And column 4 shows that doesn't happen for involuntary employee departure. So, but here, how many minutes? 2. Here you may question why former contingent workers who just secured permanent position leave. But to see what's going on, I use firm level data and find that the people who leave are not for new inventors, but the existing inventor employees primarily. New inventors also live a bit, but only after creating collaborative patents with the existing inventor employees. So most of the gain comes out of the, not too surprisingly, existing inventor employees, and that aspect is something that is perhaps overlooked by the managers of these traded establishments. Let me conclude. So the paper shows that contingent employment of skilled labor reduces innovation and potentially entrepreneurship. And the research had policy implications because labor market representation of contingent labor is large and growing. And it also adds a bit to the ESG literature, I think, because which views employees as human capital or assets that create value in the long run instead of a cost center. Let me finish here.
Now I know there are students in the classroom, so I have to use microphone otherwise. Okay, yeah, it's my great pleasure to be able to discuss this paper. My name is Po-Hsuan, and I'm from National Tsinghua University, another Tsinghua in Taiwan. Okay, so yeah, I mean, it's a 10th anniversary of this event. I'm glad we're back to in-person meeting. Okay, first let me highlight one thing. There's a contingent employment. This appears to be an important issue, like especially in Asia, because in Asia, a lot of countries, contingent workers are everywhere, especially in Japan. So it has already evolved into a important social issue. So that's why I think this paper is talking a very important issue itself. So maybe the author want to consider like, even highlighting this issue in Asia on the first page of introduction. Okay, and basically the Korean Supreme Court has encouraged to decide to reduce firms' use of contingent worker. And these laws offer a unique shock that enhances job security of existing contingent worker. I emphasize on existing because all those existing have been converted, but maybe the new ones won't be able to get a job just because now firms have to convert them. Okay, but anyway, this is a unique setting. Okay, very important issue. Yeah, and the authors found, well, indeed the author considered a lot of dependent variables, which I'm not going to repeat here. Basically, he found that firms that facilitate with more pre-existing skillful contingent workers become more innovative. That's the finding. And the authors further argues that the treated firms which converted contingent workers and these workers contribute to new innovation. That's what the author has been trying to argue. And the author also tried to rule out a major alternative explanation, which is managerial decision, i.e. cutting contingent workers and use more automations or other ways. And okay, so I think this is about the big picture. I mean, I knew this paper because Sunwoo has presented this paper at an online symposium I've been organizing, the Taiwan Symposium on Innovation Economics and Entrepreneurship. So I'm pleased to see this, the development and evolution of this paper. I think my comments are mainly about the framing issue, which may help the author to reframe the paper in the future. Yeah, talking about framing, let me share a joke. I have a paper, actually, I have a model empirical. Okay, sometimes I put model first and the empirical second, or sometimes I switch it order. I put empirical first and the model second. And guess what? I finally, after trying a couple of journals, I finally got R&R. And guess what? Now the reviewer asked me to convert the order again. So I guess what I'm trying to say that sometimes maybe it's like a feng shui, right? You need to change your office arrangement, you change your apartment, just try to get better feng shui. So it's about framing. It's just nothing material. Okay, really. Well, at least make me feel, oh, it's a new year. It's a new one. All right, anyway. Or some comments about the streamlining of this paper. All right, the first about framing. I think the current introduction reads more like I know the presentation doesn't go that extreme, but in terms of paper itself, it says, oh, there's an important Supreme Court decision. And then it's hypothesized that contingent workers become regular ones, and these are incentivized to be more innovative, contribute more in innovation. So that's why they got more innovation. Yeah, well, such a one-way route of framing is clear, okay? And but well, it runs a risk. That is, what if the reviewer doesn't like your mechanism, right? Then they can easily reject your paper just because they come up with some counter argument for your one mechanism. So, so this would be what I suggest. That's like, you emphasize the importance of contingent worker, and you emphasize the uniqueness of your identification. Then you show, well, surprise, surprise, there is a positive association between this decision and the more innovation. Then you try to come up with many possible mechanism stories, right? Like mechanism 1, 2, 3, which suggests positive relation, and another 4, 5, 6 suggests a negative relation. And what's the advantage of this is that once the editor reviewer think, oh, this is an important issue, right? Then they'll be more open-minded. And now given so many mechanisms, the reviewer, the editor can actually pick, oh, which I like mechanism 4. So then the reviewer will ask you to push harder on this, i.e., then you need to make it work then, right? So I think that advantage is that, if it's like a buffet, you let the reviewers pick what they like, if they think this article is worth publication. Yeah, so in order to have more mechanisms, right, my job is to come up with some alternative stories. I think one thing is like, you can think it's like an increase in long-term inside debt, right? It's more like a finance term, but basically like now, originally firms only need to pay long-term pension for regular workers. Now the firms have more regular employees, right? And those employees' pension can be considered inside debt. So which actually will change firms' debt structure and the duration, and which make them reduce firms' agency costs, right? Which will lead to more long-term investments, maybe such like innovation, because now managers have to become more long-term oriented. And the second, these firms, of course, will increase their financial constraints. And this may not be a bad thing. Really, it's almost like a wake-up call, right? And so initially, if a company is resource-rich, maybe the company manager would like to do a lot of crazy things. But now, if they have a little bit of kick, make sure that, it's time to perform, then maybe managers will be more than willing to perform and may become more efficient in innovation. I found that in one of my papers. The third is more like a human capital or organization behavior story. That's about competition, right? Once you convert, before the conversion, you have contingent worker and the regular worker. But after conversion, actually, these two groups, they compete against each other. Right? So that may explain why you found the incentive scheme as a mechanism that work. It's because not only contingent workers, they are under pressure to prove themselves, to show the company, see, you convert me, this is the right decision because I perform well. But existing employees, they also they now have a new competitor as well, right? So it's like you only have a little slice of pie, and you have to work harder to get a larger share after the intensified competition. So these are possible mechanisms for you to consider. So now come back to empirical issue. I think some of you may get confused when Sunwoo talk about the T+2 issue. Well, because in his survey facility data, he has nothing but the capitalized patent costs or capitalized R&D. And then he argued that, well, I think my understanding is that these capitalized patent costs can only happen when the patents are grant approved. Because only when a patent is approved, then it can be considered as an asset. So in terms of accounting, it can be booked. But maybe Sunwoo can correct me later. And because it happened at a grant time, so that's why you need to get T+2. On the other hand, for public firm sample, then Sunwoo has the exact filing year, so he can use the filing year in T+1. But I guess my comment is that, see, even me, who's supposed to know this, couldn't get very clear idea. So maybe you want to clarify what kind of items can be capitalized as patent costs, and is about patent registration or total R&D costs as well, or something. Just trying to make it clear. And if the public firm's patent, maybe you can consider changing to patent filings. So make sure people understand. They are, one is patent filing, one is registration, so they are of different timing. Oops. Okay, and the authors indeed try to rule out the managerial decision issue. And for example, instead of ruling out automation or more efficiency, maybe just say that we found a weaker support there. Who knows? Maybe reviewers like that angle and want you to push that. And the author also consider foreign ownership for facility level governance. And, but for public firm level, they should consider institutional ownership data, which should be readily available, and that has been well known to influence firms' patent output. Okay, now here comes some plotting issue. Nowadays, since people have to buy DID, now reviewers get very picky about how the shape look like, right? And I'm not saying that you better come up with a perfect plot, but I guess my lesson is that you can have one minus, but not two minus. But here I did spot two minuses. One is first, there's no zero here. Why? Because the event year is dropped, which is understandable, all right? Because the ruling may happen in mid-year. However, now the -1, you don't see the confidence interval. Why? Because the author used this as a baseline case, so it doesn't need to calculate. But then the issue is that once this is a baseline, right? So we actually don't know. We actually couldn't really tell about the parallel trend assumption. Or maybe this is significantly different from T-5, right? We don't know. So I guess my final conclusion is that if you don't have a good plot, maybe you just show a table instead. It's my experience that reviewers tend to be more tolerant for table than plot. For plot, once they see a plot, they can say anything. What you like or what you don't like. Anyway, these are some other issues. I think I would direct communicate with the author. Okay, anyway, it's a fantastic idea. I think important paper, unique setting. I think, I think it's a great potential. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Paul, by the way. Great comments. Even if I do not rule out everything, I should definitely discuss all of them, which I do. And year-zero issue, that's because of how the data is constructed. I mean, survey based on every 2 year. So 2010, there's no data to start with. So 2009 is the earliest pre-period year that I observed. That's why I studied from 2009 as a year-zero. And thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Scott?
Very, very, very interesting. And maybe I just missed it, and we've seen a lot of papers today. I guess I had a question and a thought. I completely agree with Po that it seems like there's an overall effect. There's an overall effect, which is you see this more innovation for the firms that at a higher, that were impacted more. And that seems like a big headline. And then you were sort of making this case, but it wasn't on patent filings, right? How did you actually figure out that it's exactly the workers who are the indirect workers who are the more innovative ones?
So that I cannot do, unfortunately. As I explained a little bit about that during my presentation, but I cannot distinguish them because I do not observe subcontractual relation between firms. So I create the inventor level panel using the Google Patents data. They're based on the information by inventors. So I divided the sample into new inventor versus existing inventor groups. And the new inventor group includes both former contingent workers and existing non-inventor employees. I mean, employees who have never invented before. Yeah. So there's a way for me to tease them out, but
yeah, that's what I thought you said. But why would you think? I mean, right? So this is a meaningful shift. And I guess the other thing is these are production workers that were mostly impacted.
They're all manufacturing industry workers, and I
mean I feel like that's pretty gapped relative to, I don't know, maybe in Korea it's different, but in the United States, I think the number of people who are on production lines who are also on patents is pretty rare. Like, in other words, it seems like it's more of an organization. Like, your whole thing with the practices.
Yes.
Seemed to get more that it was more like a shift in the equilibrium. It was almost like you know, people had to figure some new things out, and
So-
maybe they had new people doing it.
So,
So I'll just.
Yeah.
So, first of all, do you know that they convert all these, do we know for sure that all the contractual workers get converted versus fired? So is this maybe a reallocation of capital? I'm not spending on these workers, I have more money to invest in things? And then, I mean, so that would be one thing. And then it is sort of hard to think about, this was a question with maybe, when I think about contingent employees in the United States, I don't typically think of employees that are well, like highly educated, et cetera. Here. Yeah. They're production workers, yeah.
I mean, you know, occasionally you would see that
so
on a.
yeah, let me quickly respond to the two
And once again,
questions.
it's a great paper.
Oh, yeah,
But I think the headline might be the general effect. And then if you don't know, and it's like, and saying it's new people is a useful thing. Saying, I think those new people are the people who were previously those workers, unless you know that for sure, I think that's not the hill to die on.
So I do not know exactly, but still the Korean line workers, they're mostly engineers. I mean, because many manufacturing industry in Korea is super highly automated. Capital intensity is super high already, and that I confirm with the manufacturers through calls, but I couldn't find any evidence, written evidence about their like level of education or so. But and there's also a paper by I think I forgot his name, but paper showing that many of the manufacturing patents come from the factory sites. Although line workers have no ability to patent the innovation they make, they can do so with the help of patent lawyers within firm. And maybe in conclusive answer. And the second firing.
Oh, I think Poe was giving you the route to success here.
Instead of just fighting this so hard, right? You can just say like different mechanisms. Different mechanism can lead to the same equation.
It's a little bit like what's in the foreground and what's in the background. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because no one else has written, is there like some other paper on the same topic? Okay. This seems like a big thing to say, at least so I know the US context. The idea that more engaged, inclusive employment arrangements, commitment, leads to more innovation is a good highlight. You know what I'm saying? That's a good result, right? There's a kind of literature on, do more inclusive workplaces that commit more to the workers lead to more innovation. And so if you have good evidence for that with a natural experiment, that's like hugely big. And then, but then it seems like what you're trying to do is sort of say, it's this very particular mechanism. And in some sense, you can mention that mechanism, but I don't think you brought that one to ground. And once again, I think Poe gave you the route to victory here. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I just want to defend Sunwoo's claim about the shop floor innovation. so the data we have from the inventor survey, so even on triadic patents that were patented, right, in US, Japan, and Europe, about 10% of those were non-R&D innovations, and non-R&D pretty strictly defined, meaning even if the R&D people were involved and it was a non-R&D person, that's not included. That's in the 90. So 10%, nobody in R&D, and wasn't part of R&D at all. So and that's consistent in the Doyle survey, it's consistent in NSF data, that very crudely about 10% of significant innovations that are patented, forget the non-patent ones, that are patented come from, roughly shop floor innovation of one form or another. And so you might still want to follow Poe's advice, right? But it's not absurd to think that pushing a bunch of these people into from contingent to permanent does the thing. I mean, as Scott was saying, you've made it more reasonable. And the only thing that I want to say is it's not absurd to think that there's a bunch of patenting that results from this, right? That these are the people doing the patent, whether it's the contingent worker or the new people that have new competition, right? So it might help, but you might still want to give up on that fight anyway.
I just have a clarifying question from the table that you showed to us. So when you move from establishment to firm level, I found it a little bit puzzling that you actually have more firms than you have establishments. So how did you do the mapping? Because I would expect one firm has many establishments. So once you convert to the innovation at the firm level, you'll have less observations, and therefore are you adding some firms, some industries that you don't have at the establishment level, or something is happening? So what is it that is happening? Which may tie back to the mechanism. So why do we observe much more innovation at the firm level, but not necessarily coming from establishments?
I'll just, that's because establishment level data is from random sample, like because total population is huge. The survey institution has randomly picked some establishments representing on average 100 establishments. Well, yeah, so that's mechanical, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just a simple but not complete solution. Maybe you do the random sampling again and do survey, and who are the converted contingent workers? They're the like a very low-skilled level persons not related with patenting, or the very high-skilled personnel who can involve in the patenting activities. Maybe that give you some of the tips that you can identify some part of issues.
As I mentioned, I'm not trying to defensive, but I'm just that I do not observe. But still, according to news articles, these workers are the ones who are paid twice the national median salary. They're reasonably highly skilled, like engineers, who were converted into direct hires. And that's the salary for the regular employees, and the contingent workers were paid like 80% or so compared to their regular colleagues. So the 20% gap has disappeared after the shock. That's the, so there, I presume, given their salary level, they're reasonably highly educated engineers, but I cannot say more than that. It's my guess.